It's the week ending Saturday, the 20th of July, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen crowds at a Trump rally chanting "Send them back" to minority politicians, England winning the Cricket World Cup on a super over, and snow patrols chasing cars, earning the title of the century's most played track so far. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team, we have Hollie Clemence and Arion McNicoll. And from our sister publication Money Week, sitting with his green visor on, we welcome back John Stepek. Starting the show this week, though, it's Arion. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week, Elon Musk effectively told us, "Come at me if you want to live."
This will be a slow process where we will gradually increase the issues that we solve until ultimately we can do a full brain-machine interface, meaning that we can ultimately, this is going to sound pretty weird, but achieve a sort of symbiosis with artificial intelligence. So but this is not a mandatory thing. This is a thing that you can choose to have if you want.
That was tech entrepreneur Elon Musk speaking quite erratically on Wednesday. Arion, let's put aside the rather stumbling nature of his speech for a moment and focus on the content. What did he announce?
So that was Elon Musk at the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco, and he was talking about the new technology that his sort of rather secretive company called Neuralink has been working on. And specifically what they are doing and what he was unveiling are these neurons that get inserted into your brain that create a connection between brain and machine.
You use the word "you're" there to mean anyone's brain. They're not getting inserted in my brain without consent, though, are they?
No. And at this stage, they have been testing them on animals, starting out with mice, and then it turns out from his presentation also testing them on monkeys. He hasn't yet had a human subject, but the long-term goal, or in fact the short-term goal, is to start putting it into human brains. And in fact, the reason for his presentation was to get volunteers to take part in the experiments.
Okay, and we're going to park something else there, which is the fact that he has been testing on monkeys, which again is quite controversial, isn't it? But leaving that aside, what he said was, it has now been possible to see that a monkey can think a thing and control a computer by using this technology. That is quite a big deal, isn't it?
It is. I mean, there are other companies that have managed to create technologies that sit on your head that allow for the same kinds of interaction between human and machine. But this is the first time that electrodes have actually been put inside an animal and that same connection has been created.
And Hollie, I'm tempted thinking about this to think, kind of like I did maybe when we first heard about voice-controlled speakers. Like, so what? Like, I can press a button, so what's the big deal? But I guess the point is there are people who are physically immobile, who can't control a computer, and this would be life-changing for them.
Yes, there's definitely benefits for people that are paralysed so that they could make movements, maybe type. I think the short-term goal is to be able to type 40 words a minute, which is quite substantial if you can't speak or move. But there is kind of a wider civilization aim, which is Musk's fear that AI is going to take over. So he wants to kind of merge our brains with AI, which is really fascinating, but obviously a bit far off. So they're talking about downloading a new language into your brain or digitally exchanging thoughts with somebody else, which is kind of really wow factor. That's not just your regular brain implant.
And exactly right. The other thing about his technology is that there are a lot of technologies that are currently under development that have this sort of one-way communication. At the moment, Neuralink is still doing that, where your brain sends information to the computer. But what he wants is for the computer to be able to do things back to you, like, as Hollie mentions, allow you to put a language, a new language that you hadn't spoken, into your own head.
I mean, John, considering that Elon Musk says the reason he's created this is because he is scared about AI outpacing human evolution, this is a strange solution, isn't it? Let's all become semi-computers.
Well, I mean, to be fair, that is one of the core ideas behind what this all boils down to is a thing called the singularity that you might have discussed here before, but that's essentially where AI becomes so developed that it evolves itself. And because it's artificial intelligence, it can evolve much quicker than we can. So basically the moment it happens, the AI becomes God and we're all dust or, mice or ants or whatever. So the idea is that you become kind of transhuman. That's, I think, what the term is, where basically we kind of merge with the machines rather than being, destroyed or superseded by them. I mean, it's there's a logic to the idea. I mean, but Musk does obviously have a track record of getting quite far with stuff and also maybe over-promising a little bit. I mean, according to his original timetable for Tesla, we'd all have, autonomous self-driving electric vehicles by now.
And at the price of a normal saloon car as well.
Yeah, exactly, kind of mass-produced, which is probably the key sticking point for him at the moment. So he's got a habit of having really interesting ideas, but also maybe over-promising a wee bit.
I also wonder whether this use of the phrase AI is rather overused and misapplied. I'm not saying that Elon Musk is necessarily misapplying it here, but you were alluding to the fact there, John, that if AI kind of goes out of control, then at that point the machines will be thinking for themselves. No, that is what AI means. AI means artificial beings will think for themselves. If they're not doing that, it's not AI. Like all the things people talk about as AI at the moment just mean good computers doing new things that are a bit like what humans can do.
And one of the things that Musk draws attention to, or one of the experiments going on, is that DeepMind stuff, a company owned by Google that has been working on programs that can play high-level complicated games like chess and Go at a really high standard. And the early iterations of those machines were just really good computers that drew on the complete history of, say, the way humans played chess and incorporated that into their own approach to the game. But the latest iterations of those machines are teaching themselves without any interaction with the history of how the game has been played, and they're beating all human players and all previous iterations of computer that have been developed. So I think that's the kind of technology that he's nervous about, and it is that technical artificial intelligence.
I wonder if some of it is him trying to attract investment and he's trying to recruit people. That was his main aim of this announcement, was to try and get people to test on, but get more scientists to work on it. But spicing it up with this sort of civilization-wide idea of everyone going around being able to talk to each other without opening your mouth, whereas actually the medical side of it is perhaps more worthy, but on its own, and if it wasn't Elon Musk, maybe we wouldn't have listened. And it's quite a good PR way of getting people involved in something that will be beneficial to people that are paralysed, rather than this magic thing that we're kind of looking forward to in the future.
But helping paralysed people, that is a noble thing to do, and that I disagree. I think that would be better PR, wouldn't it, to focus on the health side of this?
Sure, but easier to ignore if you don't know anybody or if you're not paralysed yourself. I think it captures the imaginations more by kind of giving everybody a reason to think rather than just people that it might benefit.
And I think part of the reason why Musk keeps making these incredibly short-term promises about, say, putting humans on Mars by 2020 or whatever is because it does capture the imagination in ways that are titillating to particularly investors, if not the broader public. And I think Hollie's right. Even if your ambitions are noble in those immediate medical applications, something about thinking about the sci-fi future of it is more exciting to the general public.
And it's not just about the general public, is it, John? It's about Silicon Valley investment as well, I guess.
Oh, definitely. I mean, a lot of those are kind of techno-utopians. Also, Musk, I mean, the guy is very, very good at distraction tactics. The first time that Tesla was running into trouble, he launched a line of flamethrowers. As soon as he gets kind of maybe an issue rising in one company, he talks about his rocket company or his boring company, the one that's going to bore tunnels under America and, have cars speed across them, or, the Hyperloop. So, I mean, he's a combination. I mean, he's kind of a showman. And he is very good at selling this stuff. And equally, to be fair, on the paralysed side, I suppose also he realises that actually isn't unique to him. There are quite a lot of companies out there that are doing like the hats that sit on top of your head rather than going into your head. And what he's trying to sell with these implants, I mean, that's a very risky procedure. I mean, I think most people would rather wear a kind of, a magnetic resonance cap rather than actually have needles stuck into the brain, which is what he's talking about.
And what he's looking for now is medical case studies for people for whom the prognosis basically can't get worse, who would be prepared to try this out. Do you think people are going to be queuing up to try it?
It's hard to know exactly what the reaction's going to be, but
Oh, really? Because you've chosen this as your underreported news story of the week, Arion, with consequences for the rest of the world. So it has to be pretty significant.
Look, I think that...
Hard to know, he says.
I think that it's hard to imagine what your own feeling about an experimental technology would be if you were in a very dire medical state. I would assume there will be takers, particularly because the results already have been excitingly effective, and because the promise is enormous. So I think there's every chance that it will have a good uptake rate.
And taking on those consequences for the rest of the world, Holly, it could be, taking in mind what John was saying about Elon Musk being a bit previous on this stuff, that this won't be the moment. But he is probably talking about a world that we will be familiar with in 200 years' time, isn't he? I mean, we are kind of going in this direction.
Yeah, it's hard to know how many years to put on it, but we're definitely getting into that sci-fi era where things are starting to come true.
And let's just unpark briefly his weird presentational style. Was that headline-grabbing deliberate madness, or just a weird blip, or why aren't people talking about it? I mean, he came across really oddly.
It was really weird, I agree. I then went back and looked at some of his previous speaking engagements, because I realized I hadn't actually heard him talk before. And he actually has a slightly similar presentational style, but this was very heightened, and I actually think he was just nervous. Actually, he was in an enormous auditorium talking to some very serious high-level professors, and I think actually maybe he didn't know the subject as well as he might want to in presenting something that's intensely complicated to people who know about it.
Or was he deflecting, John, from the monkey story? Because that is controversial. That was the other thing I parked. He's testing on animals against their will, obviously, because an animal can't consent to having neurons put in its brain.
To be fair, Elon Musk is quite well known for not being the most comfortable public speaker, because obviously he's a huge name in the investment world, and so that glitch, if you like, is quite often drawn attention to. So to be fair, I don't think he was deflecting from that. I mean, the question of testing in monkeys obviously is a big ethical issue. I don't know enough about the kind of governance rules in the US. I know that they're very, very strict here for that sort of thing. My own feeling obviously would be don't test in monkeys unless you have to. But this does sound like the sort of technology that ideally you would want to put in a monkey before you put it in a human.
I don't know, though. Medical volunteers, who, as we said, don't have any better prognosis, maybe that is the most appropriate way to start. I
feel like I'd want to know that it'd been tested. That's awful, isn't it? I'm quite an animal lover and wouldn't normally say that, but if you, as John says, it is quite a medical feat to do. You'd kind of want to know it's worked on something that's not human first.
And the brain is so uniquely vulnerable that I think there are so many both short-term and long-term impacts that you can understand why you'd want to do as much testing as possible. But still,
it's worth noting that they have to get permission from the FDA first, which is like the sign off. So I guess it comes into that whether they can actually test on humans anyway. So they haven't got to that stage yet.
Okay, shut your eyes now, focus, and imagine that John's story is up next. Your brain will make it happen after this. John, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
This week, Karl Marx struck back from the heart of Berlin.
Yes,
the apartments have become much more expensive for sure, especially when they are renovated. Our apartment was really cheap, but it was renovated a few years ago and now costs €200 more a month.
I've been looking for an apartment for 3 years in Berlin, 3 years, and I can't find one. I have 2 part-time jobs and I can't find an apartment that I can afford by myself. I have to live in a shared flat in order to be able to afford an apartment so that I don't have to live on the street, and that's just not okay.
Residents of Berlin speaking to Euronews earlier this summer. John, what is the story this week?
So basically, Berlin, like most other global cities, has seen prices, house prices rocket. And this week, the state of Berlin actually bought back nearly 700 flats located conveniently on Karl Marx Alley from their current private owner. And this is all part of a kind of general plan by the state of Berlin to try and control rents and try and bring more housing back under the state of Berlin's governance. And this is due to kind of complaints about the rate at which rents are going up.
So it was specifically, wasn't it, that this group of flats were about to be sold to a private investor who the residents feared were going to put the rents up even further, and they started protesting?
Yes, I mean, these protests, I mean, this, to be fair, is part of this is symptomatic of something bigger that's been going on in Berlin for a while. And so very recently, the state of Berlin decided to impose a rent freeze on rents in the city for 5 years from next year. And that is now very likely to go through Parliament. And so, as I say, this is sort of symptomatic of a wider issue where there's been a lot of protests all over Berlin about the rate at which kind of rents are going up. It's almost like a kind of gentrification issue, kind of writ large. I mean, I think with Berlin, what you have to appreciate about Germany is that unlike pretty much every other major country in the world, apart from maybe Japan, house prices in Berlin and in Germany in general didn't move very much, mainly because of reunification. So probably from about the mid-1990s all the way through to the financial crisis, German property prices were basically flat.
Exactly. It is because of reunification, isn't it? And that does make it kind of unique, certainly in Europe, as you say.
Yeah.
In that you suddenly had all this housing stock that had been communist coming into a capitalist city. So, of course, house prices were low for a long time. But it is capitalism, isn't it? That if that then attracts, in Berlin, it was mostly sort of artists, wasn't it? People like that moved in because it was cheap and made it a hip, trendy place, which then in itself makes it more expensive to live. You can see where it's leading. It's inevitable they're going to get to this position. And they, in a sense, can they fight it?
Well, this is the problem. It is kind of like the whole argument over, the bits of London that used to be kind of just, absolutely bombed out. And then all the artists moved in there. And nowadays, nobody can afford to live there, basically. Or places that used to be kind of cool are now kind of mainstream and very expensive. And it's the same thing is happening because, obviously, as you say, Berlin was a very, very appealing city because it was cheap. And also, all of that communist housing stock, it was run down and it was dilapidated. I mean, you've got your person commenting about how their rent went up by €200 a month. But yes, the quality of the apartment block you were living in went up, and the cost of maintaining it and the cost of investing in it has also shot up. So one of the problems with rent controls and with the state buying back existing property is that you have to think about, well, what is the problem that's led to this? And the problem that's led to this is basically that the rents are going up because lots of people want to live in Berlin because it was cheaper than other places. But that means that you've got an influx of people coming in, so you need to build more stuff for them to live in, basically.
Yeah, I mean, Arion, this is a really drastic solution, isn't it? The government buying back flats, presumably a massive loss from, how much they sold them for.
It is drastic. And also, I think it's worth mentioning that rental rates in Berlin and across Germany are still pretty low compared with plenty of other places in Europe. In Berlin, people on average pay around 21% of their income for renting. In Munich, it's about 25%. And you compare that with somewhere like London, where it's about 45%. It's still very, very low. Nevertheless, you understand why people, in seeing rates of rental costs increasing, want to keep a lid on that. But you're right, the solution is pretty drastic if the state is stepping in and taking control of particular buildings. And you also wonder how many times more they're going to be able to do that.
You say drastic, but not unknown in our own country. And it kind of shines a light on our right to buy system, which isn't really going as well as I think the coalition government probably planned. So it was big when Thatcher was around. Labour reduced it so fewer people could buy at the council houses. Then David Cameron was all for it again. So they've increased incentives for people to buy their council houses.
But that's not selling back the same stock to the government, is it?
But since the councils have spent millions, in 2017, the BBC reported they're buying back homes they sold at a discount, and just to meet the housing shortages because Cameron promised to build a home for every house that they sold, and that hasn't happened. So that's the main problem. You've got to replace those houses if you're going to sell them off to people, because there's literally not enough affordable housing.
I think also the part of the problem in Germany is that it's quite uncommon to be a house owner, and banks don't make it easy for you to buy in the first place. That they expect a deposit of around 20% on average, and so there's all of these reasons why historically actually people across Germany tend towards being renters, and so there's more people who are going to be affected by the impact of rising costs.
Yeah, and the other thing about Berlin is that obviously with its history, there is probably less ideological objection to the idea of reprivatising, so renationalising something like this. And obviously, I imagine quite a kind of a left-wing approach to things in general.
All property is theft.
Exactly.
Should have just taken it back.
As Karl Marx said, yes. But I mean, I think, but this is the problem, isn't it? It's for example, the private landlords who own all these properties have actually tried to, they haven't come out as damningly as you might expect. They're sort of saying, the head of one of the biggest landlords said, well, look, I hope that Berlin uses this 5 years rent freeze to try and come to some sort of plan. But I was reading a quote from the head of the housing agency there, and she was sort of coming out. And the problem is, it's very easy for politicians to get all fire and brimstone about this. It's like, because it's private landlords milking tenants. It's all good populist stuff. But then someone said, so what are you going to do about the housing shortage? And she says, well, that wasn't on the agenda. And you're kind of like, look, well, there's your problem right there. It's easy for you guys to come in and say, oh, we'll control prices. But anytime, what a rent control is, it's a price control. If you turn around and say, like in Venezuela, for example, oh, we've got 1,000,000% inflation. I tell you what we're going to do. No one's going to be able to sell an apple for more than 20p. All that happens is that people stop growing apples. It doesn't solve your fundamental underlying problem, which is a lack of housing supply. And the lack of supply is why the rent prices go up in the first place. So they need to address that.
I don't know, though, with rent control, I sometimes wonder whether it's true what you hear, that because rent controls didn't really work in New York for the kind of reasons John was just alluding to, therefore, if we had rent controls here in London, landlords would no longer buy properties, and they wouldn't furnish the properties, and they wouldn't look after the properties. They would, because they'd still be making a big profit. It would just be a ceilinged off profit. It might stop the larger groups from doing it, but is that necessarily such a problem?
I wonder if it would stop individual landlords. Just thinking about, sometimes rent doesn't actually make money for people that own maybe one or two other houses, whether it would encourage wider companies that can fall back on their kind of funds. But there's also this idea of whether it's a human right, one, to have a house, and then also to own a house. It is quite, Britain's quite pro. It's always kind of the aim of people is to get a mortgage and have a home, whereas maybe that's not so big in Germany. But obviously, I think people need a home. But whether you own a home, what difference does that make? It's that kind of Thatcher theory that you're self-reliant and that you'll do it up, and it'll be better for the community that you own your own property. But maybe how important is that?
But the sense of fairness seems so embedded in British society that actually if everyone was guaranteed that they would be renting their properties at the same rate, I can't imagine there being a big backlash to that so long as there was an opportunity for some small profit. I mean, if everyone played by the same rule book, who's going to be protesting that change?
I'm for it, Ollie. I'm voting for you.
That's very tricky, though, because, you don't know. There are lots of issues with being a landlord, like things like voids. Don't get me wrong, I'm definitely not a huge fan of the buy-to-let culture, and I've criticised it a lot, but I've also spoken to, quite a lot of amateur landlords, and not a single one of them has got... I've always been a model tenant when I've rented, but every landlord I know has had at least one horror story about having to kick someone out or finding that, they've left and the place has been totally trashed and then they need to kind of do it up again. So I think I do think there's more of an issue with setting a cap on rents than maybe you're saying. At the same time, you are right. The property market in no country is a proper free market. It's not like Tesco's. You can't say, Tesco's, the prices are too high, I'm going to go to Aldi's tomorrow. If your landlord's being a bit, whatever, then your options for getting out of that it's a lot less liquid. It takes ages to move. It's a lot of hassle. Finding new properties isn't easy.
And it's stressful. It's your house.
Yeah, exactly. So, I guess the problem is that no one's found a solution to this stuff, and you're always going to get people who are unhappy. I mean, a land value tax is actually the best way to deal with this, but that is definitely a topic for another podcast.
Well, it might be a topic for your live panel, John, because yes, if you've been listening to John's dulcet tones and thinking, yes, I'm enjoying listening to this man talk about this subject at length, but I'd also like to hear him and other panellists discuss wealth plans more generally, there is a live event for you.
Yes, it's called Do You Have a Wealth Plan? And it's on Wednesday, 9th of October. And it's The Week and Money Week are hosting it in association with Challenger Wealth Manager Net Wealth. And basically, it's just talking about making sure you have enough money to see you through retirement. That's what it boils down to.
So you can buy a £20 ticket for this event and come out with the kind of advice that could quadruple that money instantly. Perhaps.
Past performance is no guide to the future, but you said it, not me.
Sure. And where's the event? Where is it happening? In London, I imagine, somewhere?
It's happening in London at Prince Philip House.
Prince Philip House? Did you know? Have you heard of Prince Philip House?
It's very nice. It's right in the centre.
Reason to go along in itself. And you can book your place at theweekevents.co.uk. Holly is up next after this. And so, finally, this week, it's Holly. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Is it time for classrooms to abandon the blank slate?
So the first thing that we found when these kids got to first grade, they were born in 94, 95, and 96. So 7 years later, we're studying them in their performance at school. It's a twin study comparing identical and non-identical twins. The twin method came up with a very surprising result, and that is even in the first year of school, at 7 years of age, the individual differences in the kids' performance at school on literacy tests, like reading, and numeracy tests, which basic arithmetic sort of things, was about 60% heritable. That is, the differences between the children and their performance were largely due to genetic differences, not to environmental differences.
Renowned psychologist Robert Plomin speaking at the end of last year. Holly, he has made some thought-provoking claims in the past. What has he been saying this week?
So this week there's a Sunday Times article saying that he wants to start a new experiment where he screens 5,000 3-year-olds from poorer families and identify those with genetic profiles that are linked to higher achievement, and essentially wants to take the top 500 and the lowest 500 and give them extra resources and guidance and find out if that would help them.
So you can find academic achievement embedded in someone's genes at the age of 3, he says. And then if that's the case, I'd understand why you might want to help the people who might not succeed at school. Why on earth would you help the people who can?
So this is kind of central to his whole life work, is that genes are really more important than we ever thought in your achievement in everything. But he's talking specifically about education. And he thinks that governments and educators, parents even, should all be taking into account that you haven't got as much effect on your children or even your own intelligence as you think you might. It's all about biology.
Yes, but then why take you said he's going to take the top, the kids that have the genes that mean they're most likely to succeed and give them more help.
Because they're from poorer backgrounds, so they might not get as much help as, say, someone that went to Eton or a private school, which he also talks about. He's quite contradictory in some ways in that he says there's no point in going to Eton, which kind of fits in with a recent campaign from Labour activists that want to abolish private schools. He's saying there's no point in even going to private schools because you're kind of born to achieve a certain attainment, and school isn't necessarily going to change that.
But then why do we end up with such a huge percentage of our politicians and public figures having been to private school?
They're self-selected, so if you're clever enough to go to Eton, you're bound to get those grades anyway. There's also loads of other factors which he agrees that you can get good networking, you get good facilities, you get the confidence to become the leader of the country. But he's talking about specifically on grades. Boris Johnson, might have gone to a state school and achieved the same grades as he did at Eton. Okay,
there's a lot to talk about here. Arion, let's just focus on this idea of genetics being more important than nurture in terms of a child's attainment. That's quite scary to think about as a parent, isn't it? You're soon to be a parent yourself.
Yeah, actually.
You might have stupid genes.
Yeah, I might. And there's nothing I can do about it. It's really concerning on that personal level for people to know what to do with their stupid children. To know whether to send kids to a better school or a worse school. But I think that it's a very challenging set of ideas that he is proposing, and the whole business of academic success being baked into you from the start and having nothing to do with what happens to you along the way just blew my mind, certainly, when I read this article and then went back and looked at some of his previous work. And it sort of feels as though to overlook a bunch of the stuff that he's trying to brush under the carpet and say, yes, well, there's these effects and those effects of being in private schools, for example, is a bit willfully selective in a negative way, and it supports the argument that he's trying to make, yes, which is that genetics is massively important to all of us, but it doesn't help us with some of the broader questions about what we do with education generally, and I think that's where I sort of worry about even the article, for example, that was published in the Sunday Times. I think that there's really worrying things about it if people go from that and draw conclusions and then start making policy.
Yeah, and if we put his policies into action on a governmental level, then aren't you just replacing one kind of elitism, which is kids whose parents can afford to send them to expensive schools do well, with another kind of elitism, which is kids who have the right kind of genes get put in schools that accelerate their intelligence. And in a way, it's even more elitist because you can't join that group. I mean, theoretically, the idea of our society is your parents could earn more money, but you can't change your genes.
Well, yeah, I mean, it does put a bullet in the idea of social mobility to a certain extent. I mean, the problem is there's nothing wrong with scientists looking at these issues. And they should. I mean, a lot of this stuff comes from twin studies. So basically, there's identical twins. They get separated at birth. One of them grows up in a council house. One of them grows up in a palace. And they find out that, lo and behold, they both end up getting the same results. And that's basically
why doesn't John Stepek voice more movie trailers?
Coming soon.
Basically, this is what happens.
I'll just waft that away. But the problem is whenever you start to, as you say, make policy based on this, and God, goodness knows the whole education system's gone through lots of stupid policy changes. On the one hand, we tried to abolish selection by grammar schools, but you ended up creating selection by catchment area, which is selection by house price, which is selection by household income, and also ability to lie about whether you go to church every Sunday or not. So, there's lots of sort of glitches in the education system already. I mean, I think it's really interesting the way this has been presented. So it's like he's saying, going to Eton's a waste of money because your kid will get the same results whatever school they go to. And people are quite happy to accept a genetic difference argument for that because it suits their political agenda. But if you try talking about the potential for genetic differences leading to certain, traits amongst different identity groups, for example, on Twitter or social media, then you will definitely get crucified and probably not invited to any polite parties ever again. And, there are some reasons for that. But this is it. And any time we start talking about genetics, the spectre of eugenics doesn't, follows quite hot on the heels.
And he's not just speculating. He's not just sort of putting this idea out there. He has funding, I understand, from the Wellcome Trust, Holly, to put this into place.
Yes.
There will be funding for the lowest performing and the highest performing spectrum of his genetic tests.
Preliminary funding, it says in the article. I think it's worth noting that he does mean well, but from what you hear, he's talking about like the Finnish system where you raise up the poorest, and he thinks that everyone should be given a chance, and he himself has come from a poor background and has scholarships and is obviously a very intelligent man and has managed to get past that kind of poor inner city background.
Actually, worth pointing out, Boris Johnson was at Eton on a scholarship as well, since we mentioned him earlier. Just to say. Carry on.
But yeah, he does address that issue of how a government might take that, and he says a right-wing government might use that information and maybe only educate the very brightest people, but he said you might also give people the chance to get better education for everybody.
Yeah, and the Finnish school system is a really interesting case in point because...
As in the school system in Finland, not finishing schools as in etiquette.
Good clarification, and yes, that's what I mean. Because actually Finland abolished all private schools in the 70s and really radically changed their education system. And it pretty much currently means that everyone is in the same pool, and they consistently perform above all other countries in terms of their educational output. So, yeah, it's fascinating to sort of see those policies put into effect and the kinds of outcomes that can happen. And I think it's instructive because it means that we do need to be thinking carefully before we change education systems, because you can make changes that are beneficial, but you can also potentially break things that currently work.
And that's something that the Labour Party are looking at the moment, as you mentioned, Holly.
Well, Labour
or a faction within the Labour. Yeah, but I
Yeah.
mean, Ed Miliband is one of them, isn't he?
I mean, yeah, but he's not in charge now.
He's not in charge, but he's a high-profile former leader.
He's hoping that the Labour Party will look into it just to make it a slightly fairer system.
But it's something approaching what Arion was just saying, an agenda for radically restructuring private schools in this country, which they're going to put to their general meeting in the summer.
Yes, they'll put it to their conference and they'll see what happens, but not related to genetics, but also,
No.
Yes. I think it's also worth noting that Plomin's quite aware of those sinister undertones that John was talking about. Like, it has been a toxic field because of eugenics and because of this really famous book called The Bell Curve, which kind of linked IQ levels with race, which was really controversial at the time. He said he's waited this long, and partly because he's been doing the twin study, he's been leading it, and he has to wait for them to grow up to find out what the results are. But partly because he said he's been a bit of a coward about championing genetics because it's such a controversial term, and among politicians particularly, it's kind of a toxic thing to touch. If you were an education secretary to say, I'm going to suddenly base education on genetics, it's kind of unimaginable. But also he's saying we should not ignore it just because we don't like it. It doesn't mean it doesn't necessarily exist, whether it's to the extent that he says. I mean, scientists disagree with how far he thinks genetics affect our education and all the other things that come with it.
It's also based on the idea that you are buying an exam grade when you send your kid to private school, John, which isn't the only thing you're buying, is it? You know, you're buying a certain confidence, you're buying smaller class sizes, you're buying better facilities, you're arguably buying more happiness. That's what you're buying.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that people who send their kids to expensive private schools, it is kind of connections, but there's also a pressure of expectation, which I think is one reason I don't like this idea of, you know, certainly not from the Labour point of view. It's just tear it down because it happens to be, you know, a privileged thing. I mean, at the end of the day, the kids coming out of these schools for whatever reason end up being very successful. So it strikes me as stupid to kind of rip down something that is clearly not doing any harm in terms of what the outcomes are for the kids. And I can't help but think that one of the main things that helps the kids that have gone to Eton is the fact that they are then expected to excel. You know, if you spent 40 grand, you know, a year on fees, then, you know, you had better do something when you get out of there. You know, whereas, I mean, I don't. I mean, whenever I went to school, and I didn't go to I went to a fee-paying school in Scotland for my secondary education, but the expectations of what you would do when you came out were incredibly low. I remember getting careers advice, and my dad ran a small business, and I said to the guy, and I was getting good grades, I said to the guy, oh, I know, I'd like to be a writer, I'd like to do this. He said, oh, why don't you just go and work for your dad's business? That's an easy job, you just be to walk into it, you won't even have to go to uni. And I was thinking, you know, this is not an aspirational kind of tone to take. And so I can't help but think that a lot of the time when you've paid a lot of money for education, you come from the sort of family where you're expected to go to Oxford or Cambridge or some high-level uni and then get some high-level job. So I can't help but feel there's a poverty of aspiration a lot of the time that kind of kids in poorer areas get landed with.
Since we're on education, and before we go, last week, you'll recall, I set the week's digital team a little maths challenge about the Amazon. I said, if a football pitch of rainforest is being destroyed every minute under the Brazilian president's reign, which is what has been reported, what proportion would be lost during his full term? Arion, the team have been working on this and this solely for a week now.
Yep.
Your verified answer, please.
I mean, bear in mind that we haven't had a lot of sleep between then and now, so this could be completely off. But this is what we've come up with. Okay, first of all, the question is complicated by the fact that football pitches aren't a standard size. FIFA says an international pitch is somewhere between 100 and 110 metres long and 64 and 75 metres wide. We took an average and put a football pitch at about 105 metres long and 70 metres wide. And the figure that we came up with was that it will take, at the current rate of destruction, given that there are 5.5 million square kilometres of Amazon rainforest left, it will take 1,423 years. Now, a listener actually wrote in with his best guess.
This has suddenly become an episode of Points of View.
Dan Mooney took a punt at it, and he, being the only listener who wrote in, came closest to the correct answer, and he'd guessed 1 year. So he was wrong.
So he gets the prize, nonetheless.
1,422 years, but he still gets the prize. But in answer to your question, what percentage would be destroyed during Bolsonaro's current term?
Please.
The answer is 0.28%.
Thank you. 0.28%. I hope Felicity enjoyed the jolly way we spun out her story about climate destruction into a fun game for everyone to play. That is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Arion McNicoll, Hollie Clemence and John Stepek. You can receive every episode of this podcast direct to your mobile device, regardless of your academic ability or your genes, when you subscribe at theweekunwrapped.com or on your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.